Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of the Global Spine Initiative podcast. And today we're going to venture into talking a little bit about SI bone. And this topic really is quite an exciting topic these days. And particularly as we're talking about in the Global Spine Initiative about bridging the gaps between the proceduralists and the surgeons. And what does that look like? And what does that whole landscape maybe look like into the future? And we're really honored today to have the CEO of SI Bone, Laura Francis, join us for this podcast, spend some of her very precious time enlightening us into this whole space and this whole field. And so with that, welcome, Laura. It's great to see you again. And great to see you back here on the GSI podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nunley. I really appreciate the invite, and I am excited to talk about the importance of clinical data and how SI Bone has really made it a core of our business.
I think as an introduction, you, even more so than a lot of CEOs, kind of hide a little bit. You're very private, and so most people don't know. For those that don't know anything about Laura, I mean, she has a long background that's really quite impressive. She is a CPA. She actually was the CFO of the corporation, then the COO of the corporation prior to being a CEO. And she also earned her MBA from Stanford, and is just a very well-educated, very smart, multifaceted person. And I think particularly with some of the women executives that exist in this field, which is a very challenging space in and of itself, is just quite remarkable.
Thank you.
With that minimal background, I just kind of wanted to start this. So one of the early questions that comes up among people is, SI Bone, people, yeah, you guys do SI fusions and all of that, but it may be good to give a little history of SI Bone and what initially got you in to identifying this as a clinical need and actually developing the company around.
I've been with SI Bone now for 11 years, been the CEO for 5 of those years, and I joined in the pretty early days of the company. I did not come from the spine or interventional space. I actually more had a life sciences sort of background. I was really passionate about our business, and part of the reason why is we were really opening up a new therapy for a lot of physicians and patients that really needed it. And so the way the company started at its founding was just the identification of the SI joint. It's actually the largest joint in the human body. If you look at the human body and all the major joints in the human body, every single one of them had a definitive surgical solution to treat the patient, with the exception of the SI joint. And there was also a fair amount of clinical data that was out there that said that 15 to 30% of all lower back pain could be attributed to the SI joint as well. There was this opportunity that was there that was very exciting to the founders of the business. So Dr. Mark Riley, who was one of the founders of Kyphon, was one of our founders. And then my predecessor, Jeff Dunn, who's now the chairman of our board, those two really started all of this, typical Silicon Valley garage sort of a story. And it became a labor of love for all of us, with a passion for helping these patients.
That's a really great background. I think one of the interesting things that I've known about SI Bone from its inception as a very young med tech company, which is strapped with money, one of the things that is needed, but also one of the things that's difficult to do, is research, because research costs money. I was in a couple of the earlier SI Bone studies, and so just knowing that, how did that play in, and why did you guys take that tact of spending so much of your money on the clinical data early?
Yeah, so when you're addressing an unmet clinical need like this, it became critical to developing the business. So when we initially started to sell to physicians, in a lot of cases we were hearing, and especially from spine surgeons who we were working with, first of all, they didn't necessarily have the medical education around this particular joint. They knew everything that there was to know about the spine, but they would say, below S1, I really don't know, or S2, I really don't know what's down there. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'm even talking about key opinion leader spine surgeons just were not that familiar with the anatomy. And then when you would talk to them about the SI joint as a pain generator, they would say, well, that joint only moves a few millimeters, and therefore I don't think it is a pain generator. And so these patients that they would see, as I said, 15 to 30% of all lower back pain, they wouldn't know what to do with those patients, or they may have actually been giving the patients a treatment that wasn't going to help them, where they give them a lumbar fusion or a discectomy or a lumbar decompression or something along those lines that actually was not addressing the issue. And so given the gap from an educational perspective, clinical data became incredibly important. The whole focus of the company early on was developing that clinical data. It was educating physicians, and it was getting reimbursement as well. When I started in 2015 with the company, we did actually have a Category 1 CPT code, but there was no coverage, no stated coverage at all, no Medicare coverage, no commercial coverage of any kind. And wow, it was really difficult, extremely difficult. And so it just became a rallying cry, and it was all around the clinical data. And then we were doing randomized controlled trials, of which you participated in the one in the United States. There was also one that was happening in Europe as well. And the results were staggering. I mean, they showed dramatic, durable improvement of pain as well as improvement in disability as well, and out to 5 years in a randomized controlled trial, right? So when we saw that data, we got really excited and said, listen, not only do we understand that there's an unmet clinical need here, we understand how to actually solve it. So it was tens of millions of dollars of spend that we're talking about, and most companies can't do that. So I'm the CEO of the company now. I was the chief financial officer. You were talking about my background in finance. It was actually critical to the business.
I'm sure there are points in time to you guys, you're spending a lot of money. The burn rate's pretty high here,
For sure.
And I think, but it's important too, because I think a lot of people don't realize how important that is, say, to get the codes and to get payers on board. Do you think it would have been possible without the data?
Absolutely not.
Right.
The reimbursement that's in place for SI joint fusion would not be in place without the clinical work that was done. And it's that simple. And even Medicare would not have covered the procedure. You needed 2 years of randomized controlled trial data for Medicare, and for commercial payers, you needed 5 years of randomized controlled data, and it needed to show the safety and efficacy and improvement. And it was an unrelenting process that by and large we carried all of that water in order to get where we are today.
And that would be the second tranche. I know a lot of companies that I've worked with, once they get past second year, they really don't, I don't know if we need more data. And I'm like, no, you need data. And of course, even in the cervical TDR, it's like you need data all the way out to 10 years.
Yeah.
And to get that 7 to 10 year data is really, companies like going, well, is it worth it? And the CFO parts of the company are going, hey, I don't know. But so really kudos for you all in doing that. I think the other question too is, a lot of the data that is done was really sponsor funded.
Yes.
So
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about the hurdles of really overcoming potential biases and things, and how did you deal with those that certain people didn't come say, well, you funded the study, of course it's great.
Right. Yes. And we've gotten a lot of that from time to time, but if we hadn't funded the studies would not have occurred. They're expensive studies, so it's difficult for independent physicians or groups of physicians or societies or what have you to do this sort of work without some sort of sponsorship. And so we stepped into the lead in order to do that. And then what you have to do is get into the design of the study. Is the design set up in such a way that you're going to have credible data? And that's where developing a level 1 study with a randomized controlled trial.
Patient is another $20,000 or $30,000.
That's right. And then having the right criteria for patient selection and all of those sorts of things. And then just reporting the data, right? Making sure that there aren't gaps in your data. All of a sudden, certain patients, have they dropped out? Or making sure you bring back as many of those patients as possible that shows the most rigorous study that you can. Because we certainly got those questions, and our response went back to the quality of the study itself and the way it was set up and the physicians we were working with and the follow-up over a long period of time. And we even engaged in activities where, well, we're not sure that pain is the right measure. We started to get into functional improvement or reduction in opioid use or various other things that were much less subjective than a typical pain score. So we engaged in a lot of different activities. Showing fusion using radiographic data, by the way, is actually incredibly important in these studies. After 12 months, you should be doing some sort of imaging to understand if you have fusion as well. So in total, we have published over 185 peer-reviewed published papers, on various aspects of what we do, not just SI joint fusion, but pelvic fixation and pelvic ring fractures that we engage in, really the whole sacropelvic space. And so that's the way that we've gone about that process. I mean, we even got questions about, should you do blinded studies? Should they have been blinded? And then you get into ethical questions of the right way to treat patients that actually need these procedures done, and will they participate in a study if you don't give them the ability to cross over, let's say after a certain period of time, if they're in intractable pain or... So these are all things you need to take into consideration as you're designing these studies, but ultimately we did need to fund them in order for them to happen.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't realize, and we've been both myself and then Seon and we've been involved in a lot of development with FDA, and that's a rigorous process because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul on different things. For example, crossovers. When can you do those? Well, the time, if you allow them, that's one issue. And if you allow them early versus later, it's another issue. And it can change the outcome of your study. And you can also sometimes, you end up with a result that on face value may look one way, but in reality is different. And it's really complicated.
It is.
It's always best. And once you set it, you're done.
Yep.
And then you got to wait. It's like baking a cake.
Yep.
Once you put all the ingredients in, you put it in the oven, and when it comes out, it is what it is. And so you hope at the end of the study that you set everything right at the beginning of the study, or else you've wasted a lot of money. And so I will say this, knowing many of the studies, not all 180 papers, but many of the studies that SI-BONE has produced are high level. And I think also people need to understand, as far as having your finger on the scale, most research institutes such as ours, we're arm's length. The patients are going to answer those questions away from us. We have our clinical research associates are meeting separate with the patients. We're not in the room. So it is what it is, whether you're a control or whether you're a treatment. It just is what it is. And there can be some, but a well-run study is just a well-run study, and I commend you all for that.
Thank you.
The other thing you brought up, which I think is really important, is first you fund the studies, which obviously there's a lot of technologies that patients aren't going to get unless somebody funds it, and usually they're sponsor-funded studies.
Right.
But then the next part is you can get all the way through the study, but if you can't get payers to pay for it, then where are you?
Right.
So talk to us a little bit about where you currently are in the payer market and how that's currently looking for you and your company.
Yeah. I mean, I'll first of all start out with, I'll go back to 2015. And because at the time, as I said, no stated payer coverage of any kind. It was what they called case by case coverage, which, and you may have experienced this back in the day, right? Is you submit for a prior authorization and you have no idea whether the answer will be yes or no. And in most cases, it was a no. And at a certain point, a lot of physicians would just say, I'm not going to waste my time to work up these patients and know that they're not going to ultimately be covered. So you just have to work through all of that. I would say one of the most important things that we engaged in early was in society engagement on the SI joint. Became absolutely critical because, as you said, we're a company at the end of the day, right? We're trying to do the right thing by patients. We're very passionate about that, but we're also accountable to our shareholders and delivering revenue and growth and profitability and all of those sorts of things. And so when you talk to payers, they're actually more interested in hearing from you. They're more interested in hearing from physicians and what their experience has been. So societies play an absolutely critical role in that particular process. Working with the AMA and, working with the RUC and working with these different organizations that are, first of all, making determinations on whether you have a CPT code and CMS, right? What's the DRG payment for these procedures for the facility fee? And so a lot of this was done in concert with societies and with physicians that were really passionate about this, and they went through all the things that I just talked about. In a lot of cases, they weren't able to actually treat their patients. They may not have necessarily gotten paid for a procedure that they did at some point. And so these really were, key opinion leaders that were passionate about addressing this unmet clinical need. And so at this point today, it took years in order to do this. Medicare was more quick to adopt. They used the medical necessity criteria that NASS had put together, North American Spine Society had put together. That was absolutely critical to have that medical necessity criteria say, these patients have met this criteria. We feel confident that the SI joint is the problem. So they took that information and then they looked at all of these clinical studies to understand the safety and efficacy of the solution. And as I said, Medicare is quicker to adopt because they really are just thinking about the American people and what do we need to do to support the American people. Commercial payers have the same issue I talked about that any other corporation does. It's really more about what are your revenues and what are your profits and what are you doing for your shareholder. And so convincing commercial payers was more of a 5-year process versus a 2-year process. And it was not just getting at safety and efficacy, but it was getting at the health economics of the procedure as well. So fast forward to today, SI joint fusion is widely covered across the board by Medicare, by commercial payers. It's covered inpatient, outpatient, surgery center. Some procedures are covered in office as well, but I'm talking about over 10 years of work in order to get here.
That's just amazing. What an amazing ride. So as we kind of round the circle for kind of closing this podcast, I do want to go into the gorilla in the room when it comes to doing SI fusions and talking about who should do SI fusions.
Yep. Yep.
So obviously there's a little bit of a rift between surgeons that think they need to be doing them and proceduralists that think they're perfectly qualified. Kind of where do you sit as a company as far as supporting doctors, no matter what they're training, to do SI fusion?
So, what we have done is developed a suite of products for physicians to treat their patients. And so, we started out with our triangular titanium implant, our iFuse 3D implant, and that was where most of the data was actually developed. And then developed our torque implant, which is a threaded implant, doesn't require impaction. Those products typically were placed in a lateral trajectory. And then we've developed numerous other products. We have a product called Intra. We have another called Intra X. Those are bone allograft products that are placed in a posterior trajectory. And then finally, we just launched a product called Intra TI, which is a posterior device, single-use kit as well. And so the way that we look at this is we actually have a lot of data that shows safety and efficacy of the procedure in the hands of spine surgeons. But our Stacy study for our torque implant in a lateral trajectory, 110 patients, prospective level 2 trial, showed the safety and efficacy with interventionalists. It showed that pain management can do these procedures as safely and effectively as a spine surgeon can as well. With that said, I would say that it really is more about who is the patient, what is the need, does allograft make more sense for grandma potentially, does a physician feel more comfortable with a posterior trajectory than a lateral trajectory, or do they like posterior lateral? What we're doing is we're saying we just want to provide a suite of products. We're the market leader in this space, and we want to make sure that physicians can safely and effectively treat their patients.
Yeah, I really love the way you said that. And I think that comes down to one of the reasons I'm a part of GSI, and that we have different labels, we have different trainings, but quite frankly, I'll be frank about this. There's some surgeons I wouldn't let operate on my family, and there's some pain docs I would. So it really has more to do with skill set and abilities. And there's a gap right now. And I think everybody involved in the GSI, whether they're on the proceduralist side or on the surgeon side, are trying to bridge that gap so that at the end, just like you said, we're doing appropriate procedures on the right patients, and we're doing them well, and we're holding each other to a cord. Just like, again, surgeons, I don't think just because you're a surgeon that means you're great at doing SI joint fusions. No, right. They have to be trained as well. And there's different needs that a surgeon may need to be able to do it well. And a proceduralist has maybe some different set of needs, but there's still needs that need to be met and trained in order to do what's right for patients at the end. And I think that's where we're kind of meeting in the middle. Well, just as we're kind of on the way out, I do want you to take a minute to say, what's the future? What is the future of SI bone and SI fusion? What do you see coming in the next 3, 5, 10 years?
Well, as I said, we just launched our most recent product, our Intra TI product, a posterior device. It's the only single-use posterior device kit that's on the market. Great for the ASC environment. We do think that in 2027 that this could be a product for in-office as well. So, more and more moving toward minimally invasive single-use solutions is what we're going to see. We look at different materials that may be appropriate in some of these devices. And so I think there's a lot. We're still, I would ask, what I would say is that we're only around 10% of the way in terms of truly treating patients that need an SI joint fusion. And so there's a long way to go. And I think it's just, as I said, having the right solutions for the right physicians to treat their patients. And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, Laura, thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be a part of the GSI podcast. And we really think it's fascinating. Also, thank you for your support of GSI and the company's support. We do think that collectively this is important, and hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.